My dad told me to skip Easter brunch. Then my cousin's husband asked my firm for 40mm. My name is Rachel Whitfield. I'm 34 years old. I work in structured finance at a private investment firm in downtown Chicago. 3 weeks before Easter, my father called me on a Tuesday night. His voice was flat, already rehearsed. He said, "This year it's just going to be immediate family at brunch, Rachel. Keep it small." He said, "You understand?" I stood in my kitchen holding a wooden spoon over a pot of soup that had started to boil over. I turned off the burner and just listened to the silence on the line. Immediate family. I was his only daughter. I had been coming to that same table for 34 years. But my cousin Nicole and her husband Marcus had become the center of every family gathering for the last 2 years. Ever since Marcus started talking about his growing company and his big plans. I said, "Okay, Dad." I didn't ask why. I already knew the shape of this pattern. I hung up the phone and stood there in my kitchen for a long moment. 2 days later, a new file landed on my desk at work. A private equity request. $40 million. The company name on the cover page made my stomach drop before I even opened it. Delaney Holdings. Founder and CEO, Marcus Delaney. My cousin's husband, the same man who would be sitting at my father's table this Easter, in my seat. If you've ever been quietly pushed out of your own family while someone else took your place, stay with me until the end, because what I found in that file changed everything, and I think you're going to want to see how this ends. Subscribe if stories about family, boundaries, and quiet justice mean something to you, because this one is going to matter. Growing up, I was the responsible one. Nicole was the fun one, the golden one, 3 years younger than me and always seated closer to my father at holidays. Even after her own parents divorced when she was 12 and she moved in with us for 2 years. I didn't resent her for that. I loved her. But I noticed things a child notices and doesn't have words for yet. When I turned 16, my father forgot my birthday because he was helping Nicole move into her dorm that same weekend. He apologized a week late with a card that said, "Sorry, kiddo, you know how busy things get." I said it was fine. It wasn't, but I said it was fine because that was the pattern. When I graduated from business school, my father missed the ceremony because Nicole had a work event she needed a ride to. I told him it was fine. When I got engaged at 20, and the engagement fell apart 8 months later, my father spent that entire Thanksgiving asking me what I'd done wrong, while Nicole, freshly married to Marcus, sat across the table glowing under every compliment in the room. I told myself, families are complicated. I told myself I was the strong one, so I didn't need as much. There's a particular smell I still associate with that pattern, my mother's old kitchen, cinnamon and dish soap, the sound of my father's keys hitting the counter right before he'd announce another change of plans. I remember being 9 years old, standing in the doorway in my recital dress, watching him load Nicole's bike into the trunk instead, because she'd fallen off it that morning and needed cheering up. He caught my eye in the rearview mirror as he backed out of the driveway and mouthed, "I'm sorry." And I remember deciding, right there on the porch steps, that I wasn't going to cry about it because crying never seemed to change anything anyway. I remember being 14, standing in a hallway outside my parents' bedroom, listening to my father tell my mother that Nicole needed extra attention because her home life was unstable and that I was resilient. I would understand. I did understand, in the way a child understands anything, by absorbing it quietly and calling it normal. I remember one more moment clearly from the summer I turned 19, home from my first year of college. I'd saved up 2 months of a part-time job to buy my father a watch for Father's Day, wrapped it carefully, drove 40 minutes back from campus just to hand it to him in person. He opened it at the kitchen table, said thank you, set it aside, and spent the next hour on the phone helping Nicole with a car repair bill, while the watch sat unopened in its box on the counter for the rest of the weekend. I found it still in the box months later when I came home for winter break, tucked in a drawer, never worn. I didn't say anything about it then either. I just quietly noted it the way I'd noted everything else, and filed it away in that same growing folder in my mind labeled things I'm not allowed to be upset about. I gave up my seat at the table, my birthday, my achievements, again and again, because keeping the peace always felt easier than making a scene. There's a version of me who might have kept doing that for another decade, another 2 decades, if the pattern had just stayed small and predictable. But something shifted the night my father told me to skip Easter. It wasn't the biggest slight he'd ever handed me. It was actually one of the smaller ones. But it landed differently because 2 days later I was staring at a file with Marcus Delaney's name on it, and I finally understood something I'd been avoiding for years. My father wasn't choosing Nicole over me. He was choosing comfort over honesty every single time, and I had been letting him. I sat at my desk that night after everyone else had gone home. The overhead lights dimmed to half power, my coffee gone cold beside my keyboard. I opened the Delaney Holdings file properly for the first time, and I made a decision, quiet and complete, that I would not soften anything for anyone at that table ever again, not out of anger, out of respect for myself. Finally, I'd spent 11 years building a career specifically because it gave me something my childhood never had, a place where facts mattered more than who was loudest or most charming in the room. My first mentor at the firm, a soft-spoken man named Harold Grants, used to tell me that documents don't have feelings, they just have dates, and dates don't lie even when people do. I thought about Harold's voice a lot over the next few weeks, because I was about to test that idea against my own family for the first time in my life. The Delaney Holdings request was for a $40 million credit facility, tied to what Marcus described as a rapidly scaling logistics and warehousing company with contracts across 4 states. As a senior associate on the due diligence team, it was my job to verify every claim in that file before it ever reached the investment committee. I started where I always start: bank statements, tax filings, client contracts. The first thing that caught my eye was a discrepancy in the reported revenue for the previous fiscal year. The number on the pitch deck was $14 million higher than the number on the actual filed tax return. That kind of gap doesn't happen by accident. Pulled the supporting bank statements Marcus had submitted as proof of cash flow. The formatting looked slightly off. The font on 2 pages didn't quite match the rest of the document, a small detail most people would scroll right past. I didn't scroll past it. I ran the statements through our document verification software, the same tool we use on every file. No exceptions, no favors. The metadata told a different story than the paper did. 2 of the bank statement pages had been created and edited 11 days earlier using image editing software, not exported directly from any actual bank platform. Someone had built fake statements to make the company look far healthier than it actually was. My hands were steady on the keyboard, but my chest felt tight. I pulled the email thread attached to the submission, the correspondence between Marcus and his own internal bookkeeper, a young woman named Talia who had CC'd our intake team by mistake on one early message before switching to a private address for the rest of the exchange. In that one stray email, Talia had written, "These numbers don't match what I'm seeing in QuickBooks. Do you want me to adjust the export or just send what's already been formatted?" And Marcus had replied 2 hours later, "Just send the formatted version. Don't overthink it." It was a small thing, 3 sentences, easy to miss if you weren't reading every line of every attachment the way I'd been trained to for 11 years. But it told me everything. This wasn't a mistake. It was a decision made in writing, time-stamped, impossible to walk back later as confusion or oversight. I saved a certified copy of that thread separately, the way Harold had taught me years earlier, because emails get deleted, but a properly preserved copy, logged the moment you find it, holds up no matter what happens to the original inbox. I kept going. I pulled the collateral schedule, the list of assets Marcus was offering to secure the loan, property, equipment, accounts receivable, and then I saw it, listed as supplemental collateral, a retirement account. The account holder's name was Robert Whitfield, my father. I read it 3 times before it fully landed. My father's retirement account. An account I knew for a fact he had spent 30 years building was listed as backup collateral on a $40 million loan he had never mentioned to me, for a company run by his son-in-law. I called our compliance officer, a woman named Priya Chandrasekaran, and asked her to review the file with me the next morning without explaining the personal connection yet. That was step 1. Not a phone call to my father, not a text to Nicole. A formal review through the proper channel, exactly. The way I would handle any file with red flags this serious. The next morning, Priya and I sat in a small conference room with the file spread across the table. I told her the truth, all of it, including that the company's owner was my cousin's husband and that my own father's retirement account appeared on the collateral schedule. She didn't blink. She said, "Then you're recused from making the final call, but you can help us build the record properly since you caught it." That was exactly what I wanted to hear. Not permission to confront anyone. Permission to document everything correctly, so the truth would hold up no matter who tried to push back against it. That night, I called my closest friend from business school, a woman named Farah who now worked in litigation across town, and I told her everything. The letter, about Easter, the file, my father's account listed as collateral. She was quiet for a moment. Then she asked me the one question I hadn't let myself ask yet. Are you doing this because it's your job? Or because some part of you wants them to finally see you? I told her honestly, probably both, and she said that was fine. As long as the record I built could stand on its own, regardless of why I started building it. That distinction mattered to me more than I expected. It meant I could move forward without needing my motives to be perfectly pure. Only the facts had to be accurate. Over the next 10 days, I worked alongside Priya and our outside counsel to build a complete paper trail. We requested the original bank statements directly from the financial institutions listed, bypassing anything Marcus had submitted himself. The real numbers came back 4 days later. Revenue wasn't $14 million higher than reported. It was actually $6 million lower than what Marcus had told even his own tax preparer. The key, company was not scaling. It was quietly failing, and Marcus had been borrowing from 3 different smaller lenders for the past year just to keep it running, none of which appeared anywhere in his pitch deck. We also discovered that the retirement account listed as collateral had never been properly authorized by my father. The signature on the collateral authorization form did not match my father's actual signature, which we verified against 3 other documents he had signed for the firm's client records over the years, since I had helped him move some old investments through our firm 2 years earlier. It was forged. Priya pulled both signatures upside. By side on the large monitor at the end of the conference table, the genuine one from my father's investment paperwork beside the one on the collateral form. Even to an untrained eye, the difference was visible once you knew to look. The pressure was too even, too practiced. The kind of signature someone traces slowly rather than signs quickly out of habit. Our forensic document specialist confirmed it formally 2 days later, noting inconsistent stroke pressure and pen lift patterns inconsistent with a natural signature. Standard language, but it made the forgery undeniable on paper, which was exactly what I needed. I sat with that fact for a long moment in the quiet of the conference room, Someone had forged my father's signature to pledge his retirement savings against a company that was already sinking. I thought about all. The years he'd worked, the small, dented briefcase he still carried, the retirement dinners he used to talk about someday having with my mother before she passed. And I felt something harden quietly in my chest. Not rage exactly. More like resolve settling into place. I called our outside counsel, a sharp, calm attorney named David Osei, and asked him to walk me through exactly what our legal obligations were, both to the firm and, separately, to my father as an individual, whose identity had potentially been used without consent. Before I called David, Priya walked me through exactly how the firm's internal escalation process worked, step by step, so I understood what was about to happen before it happened, rather than being surprised by it later. She explained that once forensic document review confirmed falsification, the file automatically triggered 3 separate actions: formal denial of the credit application, a written notice to the individual whose identity had been used without proper authorization, and a compliance filing with the appropriate financial oversight body, since knowingly submitting falsified statements for a facility this size crossed well past an internal matter. None of those 3 actions required my personal involvement, she reminded me, which meant I could step back entirely if I wanted to and let the process run on its own. I told her I didn't want to step back. I wanted to help make sure it was airtight, precisely because it involved my own father, and I didn't want a single detail to be sloppy enough for anyone to later claim this had been personal instead of accurate. Priya nodded and said that was exactly the right instinct. The cleanest way to protect someone you love from being wrongly dragged into someone else's fraud is to make sure the record around them is flawless. David was clear. The firm had to formally reject the deal and file the appropriate regulatory disclosures regarding the falsified documents, since submitting fraudulent bank statements and forged collateral authorization to a financial institution isn't just a rejected application, it's a reportable event. Separately, as a private matter, my father had the right to know his identity may have been used fraudulently, and the right to pursue his own legal remedy if he chose to. I asked David one more thing. I asked him how I should handle telling my father, given the family relationship. He said, "Tell him the facts, calmly, with the documents in hand, and let him draw his own conclusions. Don't soften it and don't dramatize it. Just lay out what's true." That's exactly what I decided to do, but not privately. Not in a quiet phone call where the truth could be minimized or explained away over time. 2 days after the firm formally rejected the loan, Marcus called me directly, his name lighting up my phone screen for the first time in over a year. I let it ring twice before I answered, standing in my office with the door closed. His voice was warm at first, almost jovial, like we were old friends catching up. He said there had to be some kind of mix-up, that his team would clean up the paperwork, that he just needed a little more time before this went any further up the chain. I told him calmly that the file was already outside my hands, that compliance had made the determination independently, and that I wasn't in a position to discuss it with him personally. His tone shifted, quieter now, almost pleading. He said, "Rachel, we're family. Can't you just give me a heads up before anything else happens?" I told him the heads up he was asking for would have meant hiding a forged signature from the man whose name was forged, and I wasn't willing to do that, for him or for anyone. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said, "Your dad's going to blame you for this. You know that, right?" I told him my father was capable of understanding exactly whose decision this was, and I ended the call there, my hands steady, my voice even, the way David had coached me to keep it, if this exact moment ever came. It was the first time in years I'd hung up on a member of my family without a single knot of guilt sitting in my stomach afterward. An hour later, Nicole texted me 3 messages in a row, each one landing before I'd finished reading the last. The first said, "Marcus told me you're trying to ruin his deal." The second said, "Whatever's going on between you two, please don't drag me and the kids into it." The third said, "I thought you were better than this, Rachel. I sat with those messages for a long time before I answered, because I understood, even then, that Nicole was reacting to whatever version of events Marcus had already fed her, not to anything I'd actually done." I finally wrote back one message, short and plain. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I found forged documents with Dad's name on them during a routine review, and I reported it the same way I'd report it for any client. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this, but I won't apologize for doing my job honestly." She didn't respond. For 2 full days. Easter was 5 days out. My father had already told me not to come, so I didn't ask to come. Instead, I asked David to help me prepare a formal notification letter addressed to my father directly, laying out the findings from the firm's review in plain, factual language, along with copies of the forged authorization form beside a genuine signature. Sample for comparison. David and I spent an entire afternoon on the wording, stripping out every trace of emotion until only the facts remained. Page 1, a summary of the findings. Page 2, the forged signature comparison, side by side, clearly. Labeled, page 3, the corrected revenue figures against what had been submitted. Page 4, a plain explanation of what this meant for the firm's decision and what my father's own options were going forward. I read it over 4 times before I let David send it out, checking each date, each figure, making sure nothing could later be dismissed as exaggeration or bias, because I knew that once it landed on my father's table, every word of it would be read out loud in front of people who loved finding reasons to doubt inconvenient truths. I had it delivered by certified mail, so there would be a clear, documented record of when he received it, time-stamped, no ambiguity. Also, separately, submitted the firm's compliance findings through official channels, which meant Marcus's loan application was formally denied and flagged, and under federal lending disclosure rules, that kind of flag doesn't stay contained. To one firm, it follows a company through future applications elsewhere too. I did not call Nicole. I did not post anything. I did not warn Marcus. I let the paperwork speak because paperwork doesn't get angrier depending on who's in the room, and it doesn't forget what it says 2 years from now. Easter Sunday arrived, and I spent the morning quietly repotting plants on my balcony. My phone face down on the table beside me. Around 11, it started buzzing again and again until I finally picked it up. 32 messages in the family group chat. I opened it slowly. The first message was from my father, time-stamped 10:47. AM it read, "Can everyone please stop talking at once? I need a minute." Above it, a wall of messages from aunts, uncles, and my grandmother, all reacting to something that had clearly just happened at brunch in real time. While I sat on my balcony 2 miles away, I scrolled up to piece it together. My father had received the certified letter 3 days earlier, but according to the messages, he'd waited to say anything until everyone was seated at the table together. Plates full, mimosas poured, Marcus mid-sentence about a new warehouse expansion he was celebrating with investors that week. My father, according to my aunt's messages, had simply set his fork down, pulled out the letter, and asked Marcus one question in front of everyone. "Marcus, did you use my retirement account as collateral for your loan?" The chat described a long silence. Then, Marcus reportedly laughed it off, called it a misunderstanding, said it was just a placeholder document his accountant used for modeling purposes. Nothing official. My father then reportedly read the compliance summary out loud, the forged signature comparison, the fabricated bank statement dates, the actual revenue numbers versus the ones in the pitch deck. Nicole, according to my aunt, went pale and asked Marcus directly if any of it was true. Marcus reportedly said it was complicated, that he was going to fix it before anyone found out, that it was never going to actually get approved anyway. My grandmother's message in the chat simply said, "So you forged Robert's signature and hoped nobody would notice." My Uncle Stephen wrote, "Wait, is this why Rachel wasn't invited today?" And the chat went quiet for almost 4 full minutes after that. According to the timestamps, before my Aunt Carol finally answered, I think we all need to sit with that question for a while. Someone, I never found out who, sent a single message that just said, "This is exactly why she should have been at that table," and 3 people reacted to it with the heart emoji within seconds. I read all 32 messages twice, sitting perfectly still on my balcony with my tea going cold beside me, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel watching my family finally see a pattern I'd been quietly absorbing for over 2 decades. Not vindication exactly, more like relief, the specific relief of being right about something you'd started. To doubt simply because no one else seemed to notice it. Then came a message from my father, directly to me, separate from the group thread. It said, "I owe you a conversation, not a text, but I wanted you to know I read every page you sent, and I'm sorry for more than just this." I didn't respond right away. I sat with my tea going cold and watched the group chat continue to unravel in real time. Aunts asking Nicole if she'd known, uncles asking how much of the family's trust Marcus had tried to leverage, my grandmother stating plainly that Marcus was no longer welcome at her table until this was fully resolved. Over the following 2 days, more relatives reached out to me directly, separate from the group chat. My Uncle Stephen sent a long voice message apologizing for years of comments he now realized had stung more than he'd intended. My cousin on my mother's side, who rarely weighed in on family matters at all, simply wrote, "I always wondered why you seemed to disappear at every gathering. Now I understand. I'm sorry I never asked. I didn't respond to all of it right away. I sat with my journal that Tuesday night, something I'd started doing again after Farah suggested it months earlier, and I wrote down one line that I later reread more times than I expected to. Being right doesn't automatically feel like winning. It just feels like finally being seen, which is its own kind of heavy. I made an appointment with a therapist I'd been meaning to call for over a year, not because anything was in crisis anymore, but because I realized I'd spent 3 decades managing other people's comfort at the expense of my own, and untangling that pattern properly was going to take more than one certified letter and one honest conversation, even if that conversation had been the turning point. 3 days later, my father called and asked if he could come to my apartment instead of the other way around. I said yes. He arrived a little after 6 in the evening, looking older than I remembered, carrying a small paper bag with 2 coffees in it, out of habit more than anything else. We sat at my kitchen table, the same one I'd been standing beside the night he told me to skip Easter. He didn't try to explain away what happened. He said, "I've spent years making it easy for people who demanded my attention, and hard for the person who never did. I let you skip Easter because I knew you wouldn't make it a thing, and that's exactly the problem, isn't it?" I told him yes. That was exactly the problem. I told him I wasn't angry that Marcus had lied. People lie when they're desperate. That part almost made sense to me in a strange way. What actually hurt was smaller and older than that. It was 34 years of being the daughter who never needed reassurance, so she rarely got any. He didn't argue. He reached into the paper bag he'd brought and pulled out a small, worn box, the same watch box from years ago, the one I'd given him at 19. He said he'd found it in a drawer while packing up some old things after the letter arrived, still in its box, and he'd sat with it for a long time before he understood exactly what it represented. He said, "I want to wear this now, if that's all right with you, not because it fixes anything, but because I don't want to be the kind of man who leaves things unopened anymore." I felt something loosen in my chest that had been tight for years, not fully healed. Not yet, but loosened enough to breathe around. I told him I wasn't angry that Marcus had lied. People lie when they're desperate. That part almost made sense to me in a strange way. What actually hurt was smaller and older than that. It was 34 years of being the daughter who never needed reassurance, so she rarely got any. He said, "I think I told myself that story because it was easier than admitting I simply paid more attention to whoever seemed like they might disappear if I didn't. You never seemed like you'd disappear. Rachel, you always seemed so certain, so capable, and I mistook that for not needing me. When really, I think you needed me the same as anyone. You were just better at hiding it." I told him that was probably true, and that I was tired of hiding it, and that this conversation, sitting at this table, was the first time in years I'd let him see that plainly. He asked what he could do differently, not in a vague way, but specifically, and I told him, show up on the ordinary days too, not just the ones where something's gone wrong enough to force a reckoning. He said, "I want to do better, starting now, if you'll let me." I told him I would. Let him try. But that trying meant something specific this time, not just an apology after a crisis, but consistency, especially on the ordinary days, the birthdays, the small moments, not just the ones with paperwork attached. He agreed. In the weeks that followed, the consequences moved through their own proper channels, separate from anything happening around my family table. Delaney Holdings was formally reported to the relevant lending oversight bodies for submitting falsified financial documents, which triggered a broader review of Marcus's other outstanding loans. Two of his smaller lenders called their loans due immediately once the fraud flag became visible in shared reporting systems, and Marcus's company folded within 6 weeks, unable to cover the sudden demands. I heard the details secondhand through my aunt, who heard them from Nicole. The warehouse leases were terminated. The small logistics team Marcus had hired year before was let go with barely 2 weeks' notice, and the office space he'd proudly shown off in his pitch deck photos was listed for sublease by early summer. None of it came from anything I did personally, beyond telling the truth through the proper channels. But I won't pretend I felt nothing when I heard it. I felt a kind of settled quiet. The sense that consequences had simply found their way to the place they were always heading, without needing me to push them there by hand. Marcus reportedly took a job at a friend's smaller distribution company a few months later, a significant step down from the empire he'd been describing at family dinners for 2 years, and from what I understand, he stopped attending most family gatherings altogether, which no one seemed particularly upset about. Separately, my father consulted his own attorney and formally revoked any authorization tied to the forged collateral document, protecting his retirement account entirely since it had never been legitimately pledged in the first place. Nicole moved out of the house she and Marcus shared 2 months later, staying with my grandmother while she sorted out what came next, and she reached out to me directly, not through the group chat, to say she hadn't known about the forged signature until that Sunday, and that she was sorry for how many holidays she'd let slide by without noticing what was happening to me at that table. I believed her. People can be blind to a pattern that isn't happening to them. About a month after everything settled, my grandmother invited me to Sunday lunch, just the 2 of us, no one else at the table. She'd made the same pot roast she'd made every Sunday, of my childhood, and we ate at her small kitchen table with the window cracked open, the smell of cut grass drifting in from her backyard. She told me she'd known, in some quiet corner of her mind, that I'd been overlooked for years, and that she regretted never saying anything sooner, because saying nothing had felt, at the time, like staying out of it. And she understood now that staying out of it had actually meant choosing a side without ever admitting it. I told her it meant more than she knew. Hearing her say that out loud, and we didn't talk about Marcus or Nicole or the loan at all that afternoon. We just ate pot roast and talked about her garden, and it was the first family meal in years that felt entirely unweighted. Nothing to prove, no seat I had to earn. The following Easter, Almost exactly a year after that first phone call, my father called again, 3 weeks out. Same as always. This time his voice was different, lighter somehow, less rehearsed. He asked if I'd help him pick the wine this year, since I always had better taste than he did, and he asked what time worked best for my schedule, instead of simply telling me what to expect. I stood in that same kitchen, the same wooden spoon in my hand, and I told him I'd be there, and that I was glad he asked. When I arrived that Sunday, my seat was already set, right beside his, the way it should have been for the last 35 years, and nobody made a comment about it. It simply was what it now was. Nicole was there too, without Marcus, quieter than I remembered her, and at one point during dessert, she reached over and squeezed my hand and said, "I'm glad you're here," and I told her I was glad to be there, and for the first time in years, I actually meant it without any complicated feeling underneath the words. I changed very little about my daily life after all of this, and that was the point. My mornings still start the same way. Coffee, a walk, the quiet hour before work where nobody needs anything from me, but my phone doesn't buzz with last-minute cancellations from my father anymore because he calls ahead now, every time, even for small things. I still keep my documents organized the same careful way I always have. Out of habit, out of profession, but also because I learned something that Easter that I don't think I'll ever unlearn. The people who count on you to stay quiet are usually the same people who benefit most from your silence. This wasn't about revenge. Never wanted Marcus to lose everything out of spite, and I take no pleasure in watching a company collapse or a marriage strain under pressure. What I wanted was simple. I wanted the truth to exist on paper, clearly, with dates and signatures and numbers that couldn't be argued with, so that nobody could quietly rewrite what actually happened, the way my family had quietly rewritten my place at that table for years without ever saying it out loud. Self-respect isn't loud. It doesn't need a scene or a raised voice, it just needs documentation, boundaries, and the willingness to let consequences land exactly where they belong without stepping in to soften them for people who never softened anything for you. I've learned there's a real difference between wanting someone to fail and simply refusing to catch them anymore, and for a long time I confused the two, thinking that stepping back from covering for people made me the cause of what happened to them. Instead of understanding that I was never the cause, I was only ever the one who used to absorb the impact quietly, so no one else had to feel it. I don't do that anymore, not because I stopped loving my family, but because I finally understood that love without honesty isn't really peace. It's just delay, and delay always comes due eventually, usually at the worst possible moment, the way it did that Easter Sunday around my father's table. I think about that phone call sometimes, the one where my father asked me to keep it small. Understand now that he wasn't just talking about brunch. He was describing exactly how much space I'd been allowed to take up in my own family for most of my life. I'm not small anymore. Not because I got louder, but because I stopped shrinking to make other people comfortable. So here's my question for you, because I'd really like to know. Have you ever been the one quietly asked to step back while someone else took your seat at the table? And what did it take for you to finally say no more? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and I promise you your story matters just as much as mine. If this story meant something to you, please hit like, subscribe for more real stories about family, boundaries, and quiet justice, and share this with someone who needs to hear that self-respect is always worth the discomfort it costs at first. Thank you so much for watching until the very end. It truly means everything to this channel. This story is a work of fiction,